Okay, we're pleased to have President, it is President, isn't it? Did I understand that right? Mark Bench with us today. He is a major market broadcast manager and former vice president and general manager of the award-winning New York FM radio station, WRFM. Bench has been involved in the World Press Freedom Committee since 1976. He's a member of the board of directors of the International Association of Broadcasting. He's headquartered in Montevideo, Uruguay, where you also served a mission. And did I mispronounce that like I did Capistrano too? I apologize for my Spanish pronunciations. He's done that for 17 years and is IAB's first vice president for 8 years. He is the chair of media training at Central and Eastern Europe for the International Media Fund and conducted media training seminars in that region for the International Research and Exchange Board and in Latin America for the State Department. Brother Bench now lives in White Plains, New York, was the mayor of nearby Scarsdale, New York for 2 years, and before that served as deputy mayor and police commissioner and as finance committee chairman, He's fluent in Spanish, as I mentioned, having served a Spanish-speaking mission, and has been working as an international broadcast management consultant. He and his wife, Dorothy, have 4 grown children, one of whom I learned just a second ago is now living in Yerevan, Armenia. And the other 3, are they abroad as well? Denver, well, for someone from New York, that might be abroad. For us, it's not, maybe. But I'll turn the time over to Brother Bench, and appreciate you coming.
Thank you. See if I can figure out all this technology. They say it takes about 5 seconds to warm up. There we go. In 1976, as was mentioned, my wife and I were living in Scarsdale, New York, and we had 4 small kids, and my boss was Arch Madsen, who was president of the church's broadcasting entities. And I had originally been hired by Bonneville to go down to South America to manage the church's minority interest in a radio and TV complex that they were going to buy. And what happened was the economy of Uruguay, as we say in Yiddish, platzt. It died. And they decided not to make the investment, and here I was. So Arch Madsen, who was doing a great deal of traveling internationally because he was the chairman of the international committee of the National Association of Broadcasters, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And so I would go with him on trips to Latin America, and sometimes the meetings would go until 3 o'clock in the morning, and I would interpret for him and tell him what everybody else was saying, and then tell him what he ought to say, and then he'd say it, and then I'd translate it into Spanish. I got a little old for him, and finally he just said, why don't you just take over that responsibility in Latin America? So I did. Put a lot of, you've heard it said, you know I'm really 27 years old, I just did a lot of traveling. I have a missionary companion with me. I have my wife's, I had to pack the room. My wife's brother is with us, Professor Don Norton, and I'm delighted that you came. Whether it was a requirement or whether you decided to, thank you for being here. I mentioned 1976. That was a year that UNESCO, which I'm sure you're all aware of, United Nations Educational Scientific and Cultural Organization, had decided there were a number of organizations at that time that were involved. The G77, or so-called, for UNESCO, they wanted what was called the New World Information and Communication Order. And the Soviet Union, everybody used to say, oh, this is a Soviet plan. It isn't at all. They just joined with them, thought that it was a good idea. But the ramifications for the West were enormous. They complained that all the news was one way. The news came from United States and other Western countries to their countries. that the only things that were, it was all Western. They wanted us to carry developmental news about their countries, not just disasters. And by the way, that's not such a bad idea. But how do you get developmental news from these countries? It's really rather difficult. Because frankly, most of the countries of the world, at least by 1976, the information was obtainable only from the governments. And hence they were propaganda for the most part. They also were demanding in this NUICO, this New World Information Communication Order, they demanded that if we printed or broadcast anything that they disagreed with, that they could come and, if it was a front page article, they insisted that it be put on the front page again. There was no way that in the West, that front pages or headlines in newscasts around the world were going to be turned over to somebody else for their broadcast judgment. This happens to be the former Secretary General of UNESCO, Amadou Matar Mbo of Senegal, whom I knew. This was who was running UNESCO at the time in 1976 and for some while after. And this was the kind of thing they were spending tons of money on researching. How they could set up situations better where developmental things could occur, where the West would not be in charge of everything. And so they were spending money like mad to prove their allegations, this G77 in the Soviet Union. Well, the US and the UK were just sick of it. And so it took a number of years, but finally, and you can't just quit UNESCO, you have to give a year's notice. So during the Reagan era, notice was given and the US pulled out, pulling an enormous financial plug out of UNESCO's budget. So we sent observers, but we did not, we were not participants. During that period of time, it dawned on UNESCO that if they were going to continue to live, they were going to have to change their ways. They were such spenders. Then, let's see, where am I? Federico Mayor of Spain became the Secretary General of UNESCO. What a sea change. How very, very difficult it was for Federico Mayor to turn around that enormous ship from anti-free press to free press. But he is to be given a great deal of the credit. And then in 1990, I believe it was, Koichiro Matsuura, Matsuuraw, became the Secretary General. And boy, I'll tell you, with our assistance, etc., this man has really been for free press, and we're just delighted with him. We work very, very closely with him. As a matter of fact, they give an award every year, and the award was given to Raúl Rivero of Cuba, who is currently jailed, and the Cuban government went nuts over how dare UNESCO take partisan position like that. And he just said, well, we don't care. This is, we're very concerned about him and his health, and we want to give him a free press award. NUICO demanded that journalists be educated in just special journalism schools. Well, sure, the journalism schools that the propagandists in the government decided would be the proper schools. And they had to be licensed, of course, by that. As they graduated, they were given a license. And they were only to submit developmental articles, not disasters or negative stories. Well, what's a journalist's responsibility? Somebody help me. What is a journalist's responsibility? To what? Tell the truth. First to discover, to find out the truth, and then either publish it or broadcast it, right? So does it, do we look for developmental articles? And, whatever the truth is, you publish it. Or print it. Or broadcast it. Stephen Schmidt of Costa Rica was a journalist who worked on Tico Times, which was an English-speaking newspaper in Costa Rica. This occurred, 15 years ago. And there was a law in Costa Rica that said they had to have graduated from the proper university and the J school there. And he didn't. He just wrote for the newspaper. And so his license was yanked. And while he wasn't jailed, he couldn't work. And that's what he did for a living. So, but the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the ICHR, overturned Costa Rica on that one. And Stephen Schmidt now writes. Many countries have what are called insult laws. They go way back. If you believe that your emperor was appointed or anointed by deity, how could you ever say a negative word about him or her? I think they've all been hymns. And of course, we believe there's nothing a journalist can write or broadcast that should land him or her in jail because of the First Amendment. Do you remember who knows what the First Amendment says? Can I review it with you? Of the Bill of Rights, Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press is established very early in our country. But other countries don't have a First Amendment. In Chile, there are 350 government officials, either appointed or elected, who are protected by, used to be 8, now 7 insult laws in that country. Mr. Paxman, you are a judge in Chile. And Trevor, you are a journalist in Chile. You find that Sister Paxman, as a judge, has been taking money under the table to be lenient. Okay? And Trevor can prove it. He's got photographs, he's got tapes, this is an inside story. Okay? But we've got the goods on her. That's enough, right? So he prints it. Which of you goes to jail? Why? Because truth, it doesn't make any difference whether it was true. Okay? Now we were just about ready to get those laws changed in Chile, and we've been working very, very hard on it. The president of the country's been writing us, and we've been going back and forth. He wants those laws changed, and something dreadful happened. Somebody on the Supreme Court turned out to be a pedophile, and somebody else in the Senate turned out to be a pornographer. So they're not about ready to give up their rights. They want to be protected. They don't want to be insulted. Remember, truth doesn't make any difference about truth in that country. In Spain, José Luis Gutiérrez, wrote an article. No, I'm sorry. He was the editor of the newspaper, Rosa somebody, whose last name I can't remember at the moment. But Rosa wrote the article, and she didn't write the headline. But what happened was a truck had been caught with a great deal of hashish in it near the Moroccan border inside Spain. And so the headline, and the truck belonged to King Hassan II of Morocco, who has since passed away. But the article told about, they must be involved in the drug traffic because this is a family truck and so forth, as did the headline. No one disputes the veracity of the content of the article. The judges, 6 judges, said, we don't dispute the truth of it, but you can't insult the king of another country. And so these guys lost their newspaper, and they don't know what the fine is yet. And we're doing amicus briefs. And this guy, Jose Luis Gutierrez, is a killer, and he's going to go after this. We'll probably take it, and we will go with him to the European Court of Human Rights. And this is a major case. But Spain is a modern country. How could they be doing insult laws? I brought for each of you a hiding from the people, how insult laws restrict public scrutiny of public officials, what can be done about it. You've all seen small copies of the Constitution to copy around. This is what these are for. I want you to take one and take several for later. I brought a couple of other publications I'll explain later. We also are working around the world to eliminate criminal defamation laws. You know the difference between libel and slander. Libel is printed and slander is spoken. And criminal defamation are brought by prosecutors, and civil, anybody can sue anybody else for you're ruining my reputation. There are 17 states in the United States, 17 states and territories in the United States that have criminal defamation laws. Do you know a state? Does anybody know a state that has a criminal defamation law?
Utah.
Yes. Yes. It's crazy to have criminal defamation laws. Now, we believe that sufficient remedy is in civil law. From the winter 2002 edition of the News, Media, and the Law, a Kansas publication, it says, in Utah, a Beaver County prosecutor in January dropped criminal defamation charges against a high school student who posted offensive statements on his website after the teen was unsuccessfully prosecuted under another criminal libel law that was found unconstitutional. And the background, you all know, the teen, Ian Lake, maintained a website on which he made offensive statements about classmates and school officials. And some of the individuals that he offended, whom he offended, sued him, and those claims were settled in civil court. But there was an editorial in the Salt Lake Tribune and Utah's Daily Herald that said, "We are pleased that the court has thrown out this anachronistic, unconstitutional law. While perhaps offensive, Ian's statements are not criminal, and the overzealous prosecution of this young man reflects precisely the kind of heavy-handed censorship the First Amendment forbids." Nevertheless, despite a failed first attempt, they brought new charges against this young man under a more recent criminal defamation statute in November, still 2002. The newer statute was thought to lack the constitutional problems found in the earlier law. But before he could complete the second prosecution, the prosecutor, an elected official, was voted out of office. His replacement, von Christiansen, is that right, Christiansen, announced in January, I guess, of 02 or 03, that the second set of charges would be dropped. He told the court that in light of the High Court's decision, he did not intend to pursue another criminal defamation case. Criminal prosecution of speech is a dangerous notion, said media attorney Jeffrey Hunt. In this case, the high school principal targeted by Mr. Lake's speech obtained his remedy through the filing of a civil defamation action against Mr. Lake. The principal has since moved on, and there is simply no public purpose served by pursuing the prosecution. Earlier this year, a cohort of mine and I were in Washington, D.C., attending an Inter-American Press Association conference where they invite judges and senators and congresspersons from all over Latin America, well, no, all over the Americas. We've been working on this criminal defamation issue, particularly in Argentina and in Mexico. So we called out the Speaker of the House of Mexico into the hallway and said, let me get out of your way, we'd really like to work with you in eliminating criminal defamation laws in your country. And he said, funny you should mention that. He said, I have a criminal defamation case right now against a journalist. So, we thought, oh, brother, we picked the right person. So we said, tell us about it. He said, well, all of a sudden there turned up a publication, a tabloid, with my picture, my face on the front of it, that size, stating that I was mafioso. He said, that couldn't be further from the truth. So he said, but it was a weekly, and next week it came out, my picture on the front again, I'm stepping out on my wife. It couldn't be further from the truth. So he said, 2 days later, knock on my door, it was the publisher of this scurrilous publication. He said, hey, look, he said, I know the stuff's false, and for $500 a month, I'll stop publishing stuff like that. And my cohort and I said, that's not criminal defamation, that's extortion. And the laws against extortion are much stronger than, and he said, oh, you're absolutely right. I will work with you on this project. But, it's amazing. There are journalists who are jerks. Pick your guy. By the way, our good friend, I have to give credit, Drew Ludlow did these slides for me, and he said, I hope you don't mind this one. I said, no, I thought it was great. You should have seen the cruddy slides I'd fixed up. I took a PowerPoint class, 8 years ago, and then I took an advanced PowerPoint class, and my teacher would roll over, she'd just kill me for the stuff I turned out. But you may not be aware of this, but in other countries, journalists can be really dogs. They can, I'm not suggesting that there aren't some here as well, but journalists will go to a company and say, hey, look, I can place an article in the local paper and make it look really good for you, but I need some, I got to do a lot of research and I kind of need a little bit of help financially. Oh, sure. And you all know that news stories about your company is much more valuable than an ad because people read and believe news stories much more than ads. And pay for play is absolutely amazing and is much, it ought not to occur. I was recently, Colin Powell had announced a bunch of new ambassadors, and ambassadors from around the world were invited to the State Department, and I got to go. I don't know why, but I got to go and met a number of ambassadors from around the world. And one from Algeria said to me, would you please come and teach our journalists to be professional? I said, well, our organization doesn't do training anymore. We used to. But he said, we need you, we really need to do it. He said, I just can't tell you how crummy our journalists are. They'll print any little dumb thing. And it happens. So U.S. pulled out, but 20 years later, again at our recommendation, among other things, 2 new secretaries, this is Federico Mayor and Koichiro Matsuda. I said 90, it was 99. UNESCO is now a bastion of press freedom and freedom of expression. But interestingly enough, if there were a bunch of staff that remained, this is why Federico Mayor had such a difficult time, is all the staff was all programmed to do this other junk. And there's still some left during Matsuda's era. But so the new ambassador appointed by President Bush to UNESCO is Louise Oliver. The most what was it? Well, Louise Oliver does not look like a diplomat. She looks like a housewife. Not particular, and what's wrong with that? But I mean, she's not elegant and suave, but boy, she's smart as a whip. And we have spent a great deal of time with her in bring her up to snuff on press freedom issues, why we left, and what needs to be done in UNESCO on a regular basis. And she listens, and she's great. We not only just, we meet with her on a regular basis. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in 1948 with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, the following appears. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. We constantly make reference to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, what did the United Nations look like in 1948? Who was a member of the United Nations in 1948? Mostly Western countries. Well, by 1966, it didn't look like that anymore. And so in 1966, another document was written up called the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Okay, and from here on up, it's pretty much the same. But look what they added. The exercise of the rights provided in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these only shall be such as are provided by law and are necessary. Who says it's necessary? The government. Okay? For respect of the rights or reputation of others, wait a minute, we say civil defamation laws are ample, and for the protection of national security or of public order, or of public health or morals. Oh, I left in the other room. The Caribbean media workers, well, assignments of responsibilities of the press, they should promote economic growth. They should promote, and so you can't talk about negative things in your own country because we got to promote tourism. And if they're promoting tourism, oh please, you can't talk anything negative about the country. And codes of ethics. That's, I attended a Caribbean media workers seminar in Antigua. And they said, you can't do, I happened to look at their little brochure that said their duties, and they were to avoid any insults to anyone based on religion, race, etc., etc. And their last item was and they must refrain from anything that negatively affects the sovereignty of the countries of the Caribbean. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. I said to the president before my talk, I said to him, do you mind if I kind of needle on those two issues? He said, I didn't want them in there, but in order to get everybody together, we had to allow those to go. I said, thank you very much. That was a good background. So I get in and I said, by the way, take out a pen. I want to add to those insult categories. And they said, okay. They didn't recognize irony yet. I said, have any of you heard blonde jokes? And they said, what are you talking about? How dumb blondes are. And I said, write down hair color. So they did. They wrote down hair color. And I said, and what about short people? Jokes against short people are just really offensive. So they write height. So then I said, and I'm sick of bald jokes. So put, lack of hair. So he just kept adding to the list until they finally said, what is this? And I said, there is absolutely no category of human beings that that a word is not an insult to. Motherhood is an insult to some people. So why don't you just eliminate it and just be professionals? And they said, oh yeah, you're right. So then we got down to no negatively affecting the sovereignty of the countries. And I said, oh yeah, that's how Cuba and China arrest all their journalists, or arrest journalists, because, oh, you can't do this, it affects negatively the sovereignty of our country. So then, the whole first day of the Caribbean media worker seminar was spent on cervical cancer, and how they as journalists were going to promote it. They've got to promote this kind of thing. How the cure and to get themselves checked and so forth. And so during the Q&A following my talk, they said, well, what about promotion of issues? And I said, journalists don't promote, PR people promote. We find the truth and we report it. And so one of the very clever ladies said, if we're going to do what Mark does, then we need to take out the paragraph in our resolution from yesterday about our promoting the cure for cervical cancer. They can report on it all they want. They can go get, ladies who've had the problem and talk about it and all this kinds of thing, but they don't promote it. And they agreed, finally. Oh yeah, there it is, I'm sorry. Writing, publishing, or broadcasting measure inimical to the region's cultural and political sovereignty. Sounds great, doesn't it? Look at all those things they can't discriminate against. Race, color, sex, nationality, religion, or ideology, or lack of hair, or blondes, or height. Lots of times we talk about, we don't, but they do abroad, talk about in the name of protecting privacy, we can't talk about that sort of thing. You recall that for many, many years, no one ever spoke of President Kennedy's dalliances. I mean, it was never spoken of. Things have changed, haven't they? What would be wrong with protecting journalists? Why would you say, what could be wrong with protecting journalists? Somebody help me. Well, right now there is there's a group of international folks who are trying to get together an international convention, meaning treaty, regarding an emblem, an international emblem that would be recognizable worldwide for journalists in conflict zones. That would not be a good idea. Why don't you just paint a big red target here and say, here I am? As we think that it would create problems for them rather than to protect them. But let's go back. First of all, this allows a restrictive government to say, oh yeah, who is a journalist? We'll have to list them all on this sheet to see who gets this. So then they'd be licensed, and here we go again, licensing of journalists. Any one of you can be a journalist. Any one of you can write for the Daily Universe. Any one of you can write for the Provo Herald. You don't have to be licensed. You just have to, Don Norton used to write for the Daily Herald. Were you ever a journalist? No. Licensed? No. There you go. Oh, and then, you got to legislate. How would you like to be on the end of a truthful news piece of legislation? Who says it's true? Banning reporting of hate speech. In Rwanda, there was a radio station that literally tried to get people to go kill, was it the Tutsis? I don't remember which, but it was a horrible thing. They weren't journalists, they were propagandists. So don't say that they were journalists. A right to communicate. Oh, there's another one. This is a big one today. There's a group called AMARC, A-M-A-R-C. It's a French acronym on community radio, for the promotion of community radio. In Brazil, there are 16,000 unlicensed, and right on top of your frequency, radio stations. And we have nothing against low power radio. But when they're on your frequency, ruining your what you're broadcasting, that's anarchy. And we don't believe in that. But these people promote it, this AMARC. And they say, no, everyone has a right to communicate. That's fine, but not on my frequency. Don't mess with me. And right of reply we spoke about earlier. Right of reply is, I didn't like the way you wrote that, and so you're going to carry it the way I want to do it this next time. And this is from Juan. World Association of Newspapers. They're a member of our coordinating committee. There are 9 organizations that belong to the Global Coordinating Committee of Press Freedom Organizations. Committee to Protect Journalists, they use it in a different way. Committee to Protect Journalists, Commonwealth Broadcasting Union, not Broadcasting, Press Union, CPU, CPJ, CPU, Inter-American Press Association, International Broadcasters Association in Montevideo, etc. Anyway, a bunch of organizations form this coordinating committee. And World Association of Newspapers said, and this is just recent, national security laws, anti-terrorism laws, and criminal defamation laws have landed scores of journalists in prison and resigned many more to practicing self-censorship. 130 journalists are currently in prison around the world, with Burma, China, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, Nepal, and Vietnam having the highest number of journalists behind bars. The most blatant attempts to create legal barriers to stifle the press can be seen in, for example, Iran, Zimbabwe, and Vietnam. Zimbabwe has been a real disaster. And that is the slide presentation. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to see what I can do. I'm sure I left out a ton of stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and that court this year has had 2 decisions on criminal libel.
Excellent one.
One in Costa Rica and the other in Paraguay. And personally,
it's so exciting to me that somebody knows these cases. We did an amicus brief in the first one, in the second, in the Costa Rican case.
Right. And personally, I agree with what the court has said, which is basically that these people couldn't be jailed for their speech. But obviously, that could be taken as an affront to the Costa Rican Supreme Court and the courts in Paraguay, because those cases were litigated through the national courts.
Right. Now, you know about the findings of the ICHR. They have 2 varieties. There's one that's advisory and one that is mandatory. Okay? And this, the former one, I'm not positive about the Paraguayan one, but the Costa Rican case was advisory, but Costa Rica said, we will comply. So they're changing their laws and they're taking him off the crud list of evil people and so forth.
Right.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that goes to my question, because what I was wondering is, I may agree with the decision, but if, for example, an international body through the United Nations were to come and say, well, the United States Supreme Court was wrong here, and this is what it should have done, and this is some supranational law, we would probably be offended with that. So how do countries respond, and what are you doing about that?
That's a good question. Only those countries that signed the convention, the American Convention, are bound to by that. So if they don't sign it, they don't have to follow the ICHR rulings. So, and Costa Rica is a signatory. So it's kind of, they recognize they did wrong. So it's a really good question, and thanks for asking a good question. That doesn't mean that your question isn't going to be good. Yes. Stand up, please.
How does your agency and the other freedom of the press agencies deal with the problems of pornography and the other things where the West is in such a front against the Islamic nations and conservative?
Good point. World Press Freedom Committee has it in our name. Okay, we are not a freedom of expression organization. Free press falls within the area, the broader area of free expression. But free press, we believe that anybody could write an article regarding child pornography, for example, if it's a legitimate news article. But I can't defend that which cannot be defended. But I hope that answers your question. I can't defend child pornography on the internet or any other way. And back.
Who decides who is a journalist and who is a propagandist?
You.
You talk about you can't have laws about truth, and you can't criminalize defamation, and yet you do see mass media being used, by demagogues to incite people to do bad things.
That's one of the reasons why. That's one of the reasons why journalists really do need to professionalize, so that if they find the truth and it hurts demagogues, they have to be able to print or to broadcast anything about those demagogues. And a demagogue will then say, that's untrue, then what do you do? So I mean, it has to be, you have to have good courts, you have to have honest, true people all the way along. And it takes years to do. You can't just go in and say, poof, it's all, it's fixed now.
I wanted to ask you about Mordida. You alluded to the payoffs of some journalists, either at the initiation of the journalist or
Right.
the classic cases in Mexico where the PRI
Exactly.
there would be an envelope full of cash on a journalist's desk in the morning for unspecified services, that kind of thing.
Mordida is graft.
Yeah, the bite.
Payment, the bite.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Is corruption in general among journalists worse in a particular area, such as Latin America or Africa? I know there are a number of conventions that are currently being adopted, conventions, treaties, and other documents being adopted around the world, starting with the United Nations Convention on Corruption.
Right.
And Transparency International also is very active in fighting corruption. What's your assessment of the prospects of making any real headway against the problems of corruption?
It's endemic. One of the things that we're trying to do, and it's very difficult to do because getting access even to talk to them is difficult. We're trying to go to the World Banks. I mean, the World Bank, to the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth, where we've at least had our foot in the door. Trying to get them to include in their requirements transparency, and that a transparency requires a free press. Before they will make loans or grants to countries. There's no question that, for the most part, China accepted, for the most part, without a free press, you will find it very difficult for there to be international development, economic development. Wolfenson of the World Bank he didn't write the book, he had the book prepared, on the effect of a free press on economic growth, a phenomenal publication put out by World Bank. And he wrote the foreword stating that there's no question that there's a very close correlation between a free press and development, economic development of a country. But yeah, the corruption thing is all over.
And it cuts both ways.
Indeed.
It's corruption on the part of government and the public sphere in general, but it's also a problem in many areas of the world affecting the press and journalists themselves.
Sure.
As you alluded to.
I got a ticket the other day, a parking ticket in Scarsdale. If you pay it the same day, even though it's a $15 ticket, it's $10. So I went and paid it. That evening, I had a dinner with a friend of mine who's 97 years old and in great mental shape and pretty darn good physical shape. And I told him I got the ticket, and he said to me, "So what'd you do with it?" I said, "I paid it." He said, "You idiot! Bring it to me, I'll fix it for you." And I said, "Yeah." I could just see the headline, former mayor for $5, on the take. Hello? I said, no, that's not what I do, buddy. That's just not what I do. But I mean, there's $5 is not much of an incentive to participate in graft. But it exists all over the place. Early on, I was a salesman for a bunch of television stations, a rep in New York. And I got a telephone call from a guy. He said, "I'd like you to come out here on Long Island and visit with me regarding some advertising I want to place on a number of television stations that you represent." So I went out, he gave me the orders, and It was great. And he said, by the way, you take good care of me and I'll sure take good care of you, which I thought meant more business. So he called me up and he said, what a great job you did on that first one. I said, well, thank you very much. He said, where would you like it delivered? And I said, what? He said, your new BMW 320i. And I said, yeah, I did just that. And I said, no, you don't understand. My company pays me a salary to treat each of my clients equally. And he said, are you saying no? And I'm saying absolutely. And he said, you're the first person ever to say no. You know, doesn't that shock you? It does me. I mean, I cannot imagine. Oh, and he said, and there'll be an equivalent gift for each of the markets. He'd own me. And then he would be able to say to me, you know, 2 years down the line, I know where your kids go to school. I know where you live. And oh, by the way, would you mind taking this bag of white powder down to, you know, thus and such? And how could I say no, right? And I'd be in jail over stupid stuff. Not $5, but... So, I mean, attempts at craziness goes on everywhere. Yes, in the United States as well. Just boggles your mind. But that's reality, brothers and sisters.
I'm curious about the attempts to address corruption within countries. It seems to me that talking to the World Bank and trying to attach requirements of
transparency
are an external means of trying to address corruption. Are there any internal methods of addressing corruption within a country? And because it seems like, I mean, Thomas Jefferson said information is the currency of democracy. If people don't have information, they don't have free press. How do you get democracy going? What can you do?
It's a vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
Well, we try to convince governments around the world that it is in their ultimate best interests to allow free expression and journalists to do what they need to do. And it's a long process.
And my other question is, what about within the United States when we have a president who does very few press releases or press conferences and then calls on specific journalists to ask questions and really limits the amount of questions journalists can ask?
We leave that to other organizations. Ours is World Press. I mean, no, I'm serious. We do outside USA stuff. Yes?
In your experience, do you see any correlation between countries who adopt grant rights of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of religious expression?
I really haven't focused on that because I don't have access. I mean, I have my hands full with what I'm doing at the moment. But you'll be fascinated to know that the State Department has always been required that each desk prepare for the State Department a segment on freedom of religion in each individual country. That had kind of been poo-pooed, hadn't been paid much attention to it. Now, much attention is being paid to it. And my son-in-law had to prepare it for Armenia's. And it's a fascinating, you know, the information, I guess, is on the internet. But it's a fascinating thing to know that that document exists for every country prepared by the State Department. I would imagine there would be some sort of a correlation. Did you know, incidentally, that Armenia was the first country, and I know you've got to go, I'm sorry, Armenia was the first country in the year 300 to declare itself a Christian nation. Isn't that interesting? I just learned that. And you can understand why it's such a hated country by its neighbors, because it's a sea of Christianity in a Muslim world. Very interesting. Thank you so much for coming.